Hey, it's Valerie Ling. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm your host for the Clergy, Wellbeing Down Under podcast. I'm looking forward to interviewing an expert today to take you through my findings from my research where I asked 200 pastors down under how they were doing. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Buckle up and here we go. It's so lovely here to have, what is your official title, Donald?
Oh, I'm just a professor.
Professor Donald Guthrie.
Yes,
Tell us a little bit about your role, and some of the things that you have been working on.
sure. I've been in theological education now for many decades as a administrator and as a professor. Um, Higher education more broadly for even longer than that. Got interested in this area of research years ago through a Lilly Endowment grant at my previous institution where we studied pastoral well-being, and that's led to many more years of interest in the topic and many more years of study. So that's the kind of the short of it. How did I get here? But how did I get here into this topic over these years?
And the book is Resilient Ministry:
Right.
What Pastors Told Us About Surviving and Thriving. You were brought out here probably in 2018, would that be right, to Australia?
Think so.
And
Mhm.
it was and still is one of the main books that circulates around here when we think about this issue. What
Mhm.
piqued your interest to study this area?
Well, we had my colleagues and I, that is, we had been alerted to some preliminary research that the foundation had done, the Lilly Endowment had done about local church and clergy well-being and not well-being, basically. And then they invited theological institutions to kind of join them
Mm,
in doing some study and then sharing results with everyone,
mm,
um, which, as far as anyone knew, was the first time that had happened in the States on such a wide scale.
mm,
We had already observed some of these things in our own institution and with both our own students and our own grads. So it was a really good, it was a good timing
mm.
opportunity for us then to kind of catch this wave of research, both that we wanted to do, but also with colleagues from around the country here in the U.S.
Mm. And so, Donald, when we look at the state of clergy health and well-being in the US, what does that look like?
It's a mixed, it's a mixed bag, I think, right now.
Mm,
Um, on the one hand, just at a high level, we probably know more now than we've ever known
mm,
in history.
mm,
So much money has gone into research. So many different studies have been done, and more are being done all the time. So if we ever had an excuse, we are without excuse now as far as not just knowledge. Uh, but the findings are a bit mixed, and that was before COVID, let alone post COVID ish, I guess we could say now.
yeah.
Um, so the big picture on a large scale with some of the larger studies that have been done is that clergy enjoy the work,
Mm,
but the work itself is really um, almost literally harmful to their health
mm,
for many of them. So it's not that they don't enjoy the work, they do, but
mm,
the work that they're doing is at such a volume and such a velocity that it's really leading to poor health, not just poor mental health, but poor physical health.
mm,
Um, so I guess that's the headline. That's what I mean when I say it's a mixed bag. There's
mm.
satisfaction in the work, but there's kind of danger in the work too.
That definitely reflects some of the Australian research that we have. Work
Hmm.
engagement or work satisfaction or ministry satisfaction is not really the whole issue. and certainly reflects our clinical picture as well. I've often said that in our practice, I've never seen a minister that says they hate ministry or what they do, or they've lost their zeal for Jesus.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's what our studies are finding too. It's not the engagement with people, it's not um the preparation, it's not a lot of things.
Mm.
Uh, but I was interested to see one of your findings, which I'm sure we'll talk about some more, but about the abusive side of the whole work with clergy and how
Yes.
much they just endure.
Yes.
Uh, that's very consistent with what we find out here, that the reason why people leave vocational ministry uh, is because of unresolved interpersonal conflict, basically. That's what drives them away. They sort of literally just can't take it anymore.
Yes,
Um,
Donald, those questions were a last minute throw in when I considered that we have been tracking the well-being of Australian school principals
uh-huh.
and actually noticing that the levels of toxic conflict to the point of personal violence or personal experienced violence has been on the increase. And I thought, well, let's just ask our pastors. Um, I actually wonder whether we just don't know how to define conflict in church. So, if you look at the questions that I was asking, as a psychologist, those are toxic levels of conflict. If you're enduring that every day, and multiple levels of conflict. So, feeling like you're being bullied, feeling like you're being teased, feeling like you're the target of gossip and slander, and constantly embroiled in conflict and quarrel. If you're actually in that level of conflict every day and it's part of your work, from a psychologist looking at any vocation or any job, that's actually unsustainable. But why do we let it happen, or how does it get to that level in churches, do you think?
Well, I think what you said there at the beginning is a clue. Um, there doesn't seem to be much from the literature. There doesn't seem to be much um, insight into not necessarily how to prevent conflict, but just how to cope, how to interact in a way where something as mundane as conversation is peaceful, civil, let alone generative and productive and fruitful. Many pastors would settle if it was just peaceful, let alone if it went anywhere and did anything.
Mm,
Um, my observation is there's a little bit more attention being paid to that
mm,
particular thing
mm,
now because of the research that keeps seeming to indicate, like I said, this unresolved interpersonal conflict piece being the big rock that seems to get in people's way. So it looks like we're zooming in on that piece to see not
mm,
just what is, but what could be done about it, how to address it,
mm.
how to provide maybe some extra training, some extra coaching. I think that's where we're at right now.
And do you think that it's at the level of merely, not merely, but mainly coaching our pastors? What about congregational life and congregational attitudes? So, one of my interests is in the leadership followership aspect. That
Yes.
observationally for me, it almost seems like followership really deteriorates once we're in the church setting. As a psychologist, we see all kinds of professions in the burnout space, that they don't endure this type of in a level of almost ungloved fights that happen in the church. What are your thoughts about what happens in congregational thinking in their lives?
Yes. Well, and like you said, on a not perhaps a constant rate, but a consistent rate,
Mm,
which obviously is just bound to wear you out and wear you down.
mm,
Uh, yeah, that's another thing that we're all taking a hard look at is the civility
mm,
challenge beyond the pastor, you might say.
Mm,
How do we help other ministry leaders um, become both aware and become more adept to have the pastors back, and vice versa? How do we help the folk in the congregations learn how to kind of undo what they've learned how to do on social media, for example, and not just bring all that toxicity into the church, which we see happening, unfortunately, with
mm,
pretty much regularity here. So we're
mm.
trying to address those things. There's a number of researchers getting after that on a broader scale. I think it's just starting to be applied and looked at, though,
Mm.
in more of the local church context here.
What comes out of that research in that you know that, or I know, or I see that when we interact in social media, the anonymity, the fact that nobody can see you, you can sort of blast someone and run. How is it that approach to relating and conflict management can still exist in a church when we do see one another and you see your pastor? Presumably, maybe not. You love your pastor, but I wouldn't necessarily see that same level of interacting on social media, for example, at my workplace or at other workplaces. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think pastors are playing catch up. I mean, as thinking of them as a people group,
Mm,
when it comes to not just harnessing social media to make announcements and to
mm,
post sermons and to do the things they've done now for a while, relatively speaking, but how to engage constructively with a sort of a winsome witness. I mean, that's a huge challenge right now,
wow.
and some are taking it up,
Mm,
but we've become so socialized, like you said, to just blasting away.
mm,
It's just a lament for me personally. It's like, how in the world can we treat people like this online, let alone in person? It seems to bleed
yeah,
back into our daily lives, not just our
yeah,
online lives.
yeah.
We've noticed.
I love that phrase, winsome witness. When I go about talking about what I do, one of the things that I get asked, and I haven't had any formal theological study, so I'll ask you the question, but what about the Apostle Paul? Was he really that winsome? Did he, was burnout an issue for him? There's all kinds of conflict in the early church. Surely we should just toughen it up and just keep going.
Yeah, I guess I have another phrase that I use often when I talk to pastors, especially, and that's gospel savvy.
Mm,
It's the wise as serpents, gentle as doves, as Jesus said. It's a sense of neither being caustically cynical nor sort of hopelessly naive,
mm,
to avoid those two extremes, um,
mm,
but to cultivate this sort of Christ-like presence that, of course, only the Lord Jesus was the only person who was never anxious
mm,
with a person or a group. Uh, he's the only one who's ever been
yeah.
uh, fully present in those conversations. He's the only one who was
Yes.
never had to second guess himself. Oh, I should have said this. I shouldn't have said that, like we do all the time.
Yes.
But there's a lot to learn from him when you observe him in conversation. And
Yes.
when you observe the Apostle Paul, for example, when he's talking in Athens, in Acts 17, I mean, he's very savvily engaging that group
Mm,
and commending them for
mm,
their worship of the unknown God. I mean, it's
mm,
sort of a creational apologetic to go at the human level with what he can commend on the way to bearing witness to the God who made everything, and
mm,
then kind of taking it from there. You get a master class, obviously, in the book of Acts
mm,
about contextual witness bearing,
mm,
because here it's a little bit more of this, and here it's a little bit more of that, and here but it's always the gospel.
mm,
It's just emphasized a little bit more of this and a little bit more of this here.
Mm,
Like I would say, of course, it's a master class. It's a scripture, but
mm,
I think there's a lot to learn there that's so timeless and timely for us these days.
mm,
In this realm of
mm,
neither caving in to be
mm.
okay, just forget about it. I'm going to blast away too, or just throwing up our hands and saying I'm not going to have anything to do with it and go away, or
Yeah,
being naive, just say it's okay.
yeah, love that. So let me take us through now, and you might have some things that jumped out at you when you looked at what I found. What would be the
Yeah,
best?
sure, go ahead.
Here we
Hmm.
go. So,
Hmm.
top three reasons for, well, first of all, 30 up to 35% of pastors have seriously thought of quitting the ministry in the last 12 months. And these are the ones that haven't quit in the middle of the pandemic.
Hmm.
Top three reasons: my family suffers, I feel lonely and isolated, and the immense stress of the job, which interestingly, if you look at those numbers, over 75% said my family suffers, I feel lonely and isolated, but 49% really said it was the stress of the job. How does that reflect what you are experiencing or what your research or what findings are coming out in the US?
Yeah, in no particular order. I can think about the family issue, for example. But that relates, in our research, that relates actually to the isolation issue, both personal isolation, but maybe even more pronounced when the clergy person is married,
Mm.
there's couple isolation. So
Mm.
in our most recent survey, we ask a really simple, really it's sort of syllogism. We said, okay, respond to the following: I have friends, my spouse has friends, and
Wow.
we have friends.
Wow.
So they could answer, I mean, they could say
Yeah.
yes, 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 no, 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 whatever combination. Okay. Well, it was usually they said, yes, I have some friends. Yes, my spouse has some friends. No, we don't have friends.
Ah.
That was the most often registered response. There was more no, it's already hard to have couple friends when you're a couple. I mean, those folks who are um, in a relationship with someone, and it's hard to do that anyway, let alone when you're a clergy couple. I mean, you've just increased the degree of difficulty times whatever. So that was something we were wondering about, but our data, yeah, that's what it looks like. So those two are sort of related, I guess. And then I think the work itself, that goes back to the first thing we were talking about from
Mm.
this larger study that was done at Notre Dame about the the work itself is satisfying, but it's so overwhelming, it's not very healthy. I mean, that's sort of the
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So that's pretty sounds pretty consistent to me, I guess is what I would say in response.
Well, but the Apostle Paul, I mean, he probably didn't have any couple friends, and his work stress was probably huge. So,
Hmm.
what's our problem, Donald?
Well, our problem is we're human beings for whom isolation is deadly. Uh, in fact, in fact, one of our primary findings in our most recent, our my colleagues and my most recent research is that we call ministry tensions, and the first big one is isolation and connection. And
Yeah.
if you're isolated, you basically die. You might die slowly, but you die.
Yes,
And if you're connected, you live. Now, as you know, every single study we're ever going to do is going to find that out.
it is.
It's
Yeah,
going to find that out for older folks and younger folks and everybody in between.
absolutely.
But they did tell us that, and they gave us reasons why, and they illustrated it in our focus groups and said, when I am connected, I am alive. When I'm connected in
Yeah.
formal, non-formal, informal ways, I mean, all up and down in relationships. It didn't have to be close, confidant, friends. It just was a sense of connection,
Mm.
both sort of in the family and then with confidants and then with allies and then out even to the congregation and then beyond the congregation in the community. We had so many pastors tell us that some of their closest friends were not just outside their church, but they weren't even Christians.
Mm.
They said that it was their neighbor,
Yeah.
or it was someone in a workout place, or
Yeah. Yeah.
social club that they belonged to,
Yeah.
that they had to kind of get out all the way outside the system.
Yeah.
And that's where they found personal relationships and connections and couple relationships and connections. I thought that was very telling.
Yeah.
Uh, at least that was reflected in our most recent research here.
Yeah. As we are talking, I'm just reflecting on how I actually think from what we know in psychology at the moment, that there are two things that are endemic across human beings, regardless of what clinical presentations they come: emotional exhaustion and loneliness. And I think those two things are actually quite connected. And so it's
Mm.
almost like, okay, you've got a baseline. Most people in the world feel emotionally exhausted and lonely for lots of reasons. Society has changed, the way we communicate has changed, the way we do work has changed. And then you put a vocational hazard, which is being in
Hmm.
industry, which further alienates and isolates you. I'm curious about the couple loneliness. I've not actually thought about this. What are the consequences of that? Meaning that they're so isolated, not just individually, but what would be the outcomes of couples themselves not having couple friends?
Yeah, a couple things there. Well, I was going to say, and on top of everything you just said, there was
Yeah.
this small pandemic that went around the
Yes.
world that exacerbated and
Yeah.
accelerated all of this, of course.
Yeah.
Well, the couple thing, one of the things that they told us was uh, I'll put it this way, the spouse who is flourishing, okay, the clergy spouse who
Yeah.
is flourishing because they have friends outside the church and
Mm,
they work outside the church.
mm,
I'm sorry, they work outside the home. I'm sorry.
mm.
They have friends outside the church and they work
Yeah.
outside the home.
Yeah.
If you have
Yeah.
those two things,
Yeah.
pretty strong correlation with they will be flourishing. That
Mm,
that does not mean that they're not active in the church.
yeah.
It doesn't mean they have enemy. It doesn't mean any of that. It's just that those two things pop up all over the place.
Mm,
But like I said earlier, if it comes down to where are our friends and who are our friends, they're still pretty lonely as couples.
mm,
And when they aren't lonely, it's usually because the spouse
mm.
has some outside activities. They're not just bound to the church, but they're connected in some ways to broader groups of people.
Well, Donald, this is dangerous findings because one of the more, I suppose, what we would assume is that couples would be doing ministry together. That very often the spouse doesn't have work outside of the home. You are in community, your friends are your church. How does that relate then to how we would typically approach doing ministry as a couple?
I think it's tipped.
Okay.
I think the twofer assumption is gone.
Yeah.
Um, whether that was ever spoken or unspoken.
Yeah.
When I say what I just said at pastor couple retreats, which we do
Yeah.
quite a few of, the spouses just want to say, okay, we're just going to stop everything and talk about this now for
Mm,
a while, so everybody just get comfortable because they can't believe we've said this out loud,
mm.
and if they perceive it's even half of a safe space to talk about it, they want to talk about it because
Wow.
they just have not been able to. They just have not found where they can talk about this out loud. I think they're so desperate for connection
Yes.
that, for one, they've indicated they've gone looking. I mean, they're happily married. I mean, that's the other thing about this. Interesting that the marriage is strong. They've indicated,
Yeah.
self-reporting, but they've indicated we're good together. We just we just need friends. We just need connections. And
Yeah.
the spouse has said, I can't wait.
Yeah.
I, I need help. I can't exist this way. At least the pastor has some other probably pastor friends.
Yeah.
Spouse, they're not waiting around anymore, and they're not allowing, in a sense, they're not allowing the church to say, this is not a twofer.
Mm.
You don't get me because you got the pastor.
Yeah.
I have a life too, and it's becoming. I would observe now. I can't trace this demographically, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was also generational.
Mm,
That wouldn't surprise me at all.
mm,
And by generational, I'm thinking maybe it's certainly, if I had to put an age on it, 40 and younger, and it might be a little older than that now.
mm,
They would say, no way,
mm,
don't assume.
mm.
If you get me, you get the spouse.
Wow. Stay tuned on that front.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Uh,
pretty pronounced. I mean, it's no longer sort of a whisper. I mean, I would say it's a shout.
Yeah, I wonder what that level of thinking in Australia is. I'd be curious. I think one of the things we do need to do is we need to do exactly the same things that we're doing with our clergy, and actually ask the kids and ask the spouses, what's happening in their world. I think
That's
we'll get a lot of information there.
that's I really agree. We are just beginning in the States to get to that layer.
Yeah,
Well, those two layers
yeah,
of spouse and family.
yeah,
We know a little bit, but not nearly enough.
yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely.
Especially on scale, we need way more data there.
This is the midpoint break for the podcast. If you want to put a pause and walk away and come back to it, make sure you do check out the description for all the various downloads that we have for you, including my full report, research, and reflections. You might also want to remember to like, share, and subscribe. So stop now or keep going. Let's talk now about the other element which I found, which was one of the things that I really wanted to add or even raise in the conversation, because as a psychologist, when we are seeing our ministers, we are noticing that a sense of defectiveness and shame, having really high standards and perfectionism, but the block
Mm,
to gaining insight into that is really not attending to their own emotional life. So we're
mhm,
quick to go, this is a problem. I'll reflect and think about this and then figure out what is the strategy to solve this problem. But
mhm,
me as a human being and how I'm feeling and the insight that I'm gaining from my reactions and maybe and the reactions of others seems to be missing. Now, that surface acting, I found a correlation with burnout. I also found a correlation with destructive leadership patterns, which
mm,
in my survey, if we look at the range of being unhelpful, inappropriate to abusive, I was really looking at unhelpful once it gets to the point of forceful leadership. You're getting angry, you're blaming, you're using punishing tactics. That was linked to burnout as well as to surface acting emotions.
mm.
What are your thoughts and reflections on that?
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting finding in your research. Um, I definitely see some parallels here too, to ours in the States. Um, a couple of maybe different ways in terms of the influencers. One would be our folks would report they may not have much self-awareness,
Mm,
and which would hopefully lead to self-care. So they care more about others than themselves.
yeah.
That's nothing new. I mean, helping helpers has been around for a long time. You know that. That's what you
Yeah,
do.
that's foundational
Thankfully,
to how burnout came about, isn't it? How it
it
was
is.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah,
So that keeps popping up, I would say.
yeah.
But the other interesting thing would be there's an increased awareness and interest in um, attending to the needs of the other,
Mm,
which is fairly new. I mean, it's actually a positive
mm,
trend. There's just not knowledge or skill. So there's awareness and willingness, but not knowledge or skill. So
mm.
it's lagging on the. I'd love to do that, and I think it's important, but I don't know how to start. I don't know what to do,
Yeah,
uh, and I don't even know how to process that myself, whoever I
yeah,
am. I don't know why. I'm just reading the Bible, and I think it's important. So I should probably get outside my comfort zone, my relational comfort zone, and so forth. So there's, again, it's a bit of a mixed bag as far as interest,
Yeah.
willingness,
Yeah.
lack. It's just it just looks to me like it's a real jumble right now of trying to sort this out in a way where they see the connectivity that their own abiding in Christ can bring them even as they minister outwardly.
Is that a formation issue, or is that you need to go and learn and practice and do it issue?
Well, our folks who are trained formally,
Hmm.
say in Bible colleges or seminaries or someplace in formal education, have uh, I can say this either way, but I'll say increasingly lacked um, discipleship in their own lives before they come to get formally trained.
Okay.
So that's an opportunity and a problem, I guess.
Okay. How would you
Both
define
and.
that discipleship?
Well, have they had experience, exposure, participation, let alone contribution experience in a local church? I mean, it's just that basic level.
Hmm.
Have they had anybody in their lives as spiritual mentors?
Hmm.
Have they been in groups of peers and or uh, generational mix of folk? So you'd have a variety of spiritually mature, all jumbled together. That
Hmm.
would be obviously part of the church, but not in a local church. They would be perhaps a group over here, a Bible study here. Fewer and fewer of them have all three of those, maybe not even one,
Hmm.
as they come to get formally trained. So we cannot assume, not only we've not been able to assume a basic level of Bible knowledge for a while.
Okay.
But now you cannot assume even any sort of level of depth of maturity in Christ,
Hmm.
uh, understanding of the local church,
Hmm.
anything like that.
Hmm.
So our challenge is to pay attention to formation, to your point, more and more and more, and
Hmm.
hold hands, join hands with the local churches, even around us here. I mean, in my context, as
Hmm.
well as our other sister schools and other
Hmm.
churches,
Hmm.
to kind of fill that vacuum
Yeah.
and not pit the two against each other, not pit the formal education training and the local church preparation and
Yeah.
formation, but
Yeah.
but more and more combine those two because it's now desperately needed.
Right. This makes me think of what we experience in our industry, psychologists. We are actually finding very similarly. Uh, Early career psychologists really haven't experienced relationships themselves.
Uh,
They've been highly academic. They're usually clever and helpful people, but being exposed to unpacking your own brokenness, being exposed to brokenness, many of our early career psychologists actually feel intimidated by some of the clinical issues we see: domestic violence, substance abuse,
uh-huh.
abuse of children. It causes them to actually attrition from our profession. So I'm wondering, there's the issue of maybe spiritual formation, but is there something about our emotional formation as well, coming into ministry, just interacting in that space? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. Part of a bigger story going on here, as well as what I understand around the world, is the just the increasing levels of pretty significant mental health struggles.
Yeah.
And we've certainly experienced that. I know, just boiling it down to our context here, um, just you name it.
Yeah.
It's just overwhelming. It's overwhelming our system. I just personally, I feel um, like I just need to go back to school and get a counseling degree these days
Really?
because of the level of challenge with just mental health issues that our folk have. And
Mm,
it's not just a few, but it's more. And it's not just more, but it's more depth of their issues, more of their
mm,
challenges.
mm.
So that's a I'd say that's a developing story that we're all trying to figure out how to address, how to help, how to come alongside, uh, the days are long gone when I can just deliver content and say, okay, I'm finished. I did my job. If you're in theological education here, that's just
Wow.
our movement, I would say,
Mm.
happily is moving more and more towards, like I said earlier, this arm in arm with the church
Mm.
so that we accept some more responsibility and then act on the responsibility about formation,
Mm.
not just information and skill building.
Mm.
Uh, that is definitely the movement. That is definitely the conversation. That's definitely the way our standards
Mm.
of accreditation have moved
Mm.
just in the last few years. So
Mm.
we're all still getting used to the shift. I would say it's a healthy shift,
Mm.
but you're asking a lot of folks who are both trained in a particular way to say, okay, now we're going to have to add to this
Yes.
even more. Well,
Yes.
that's a
Yeah.
big lift. I mean, that's a big ask. It's
Which
not the
speaks
wrong
to the
ask,
work
it's a big one.
stress. It speaks
Yeah,
really to the work stress. The
it
complexity
does.
of
Yeah.
being a pastor has grown, inclusive of the mental health burden that comes with the role.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Curious about your thoughts about emotional awareness. So one of the things that my study and probably other studies have found is that pastors can believe that they're self-reflective, but the reflection doesn't necessarily lead to insight,
Hmm.
particularly self-insight as to, what does this tell me about me? How does this inform my strong reactions? And it doesn't necessarily build insight into, and why would that person have reacted that way? Are you finding similar things? Self-reflection to self-insight, emotional awareness?
I would say I would say yes and no again.
Okay.
So yes, increase self-awareness, but not necessarily yet um, towards healthy application of the insight that would be gained. So in other words, there's a middle stopping place where I would say, again, positively, more are willing to and are seeking professional counseling
Mm,
as a result of this raised awareness.
mm,
So they realize part of their, whether it just be um, coping with some things they need to cope with, dealing with things they need to deal with, all the way to pretty substantial healing needed.
mm, mm,
They need help,
mm,
and they're increasingly willing to ask for the help, which again I think is a very positive development.
mm,
I think it's just maybe going to start turning into self-awareness to, like you said, insight, and then
mm,
being able to help others.
mm,
I would say, just observing
mm,
myself, that's what I would hope that to
mm.
be the trajectory that the Lord would kind of
Yeah.
lead folk to. But there's definitely more awareness and there's definitely more willingness to seek help. It looks to me, though, like the jury is still out as far as, okay, what will be the fruit?
Mm,
Because some of them might just say, okay, that means I'm out.
mm,
Not
mm,
because they're not healed or because they're not increasing their own self-awareness and the insight that comes with that, but they just realize they can't take that pressure. They can't take the, like we said earlier, the
mm.
blowback or whatever it is, or they might re-engage in a way that's even healthier, stronger, more connected, and so forth. I don't think we know what the answer to that's going to be. I think it's too soon to say.
In Australia, there is quite a lot of conversation about putting some support roles. So we've got coaching,
Uh-huh.
mentoring, and now pastoral supervision is going to become something that everybody all clergy will have to do.
Okay.
What are your thoughts about these formalized roles and say, okay, every pastor needs to have a mentor, a coach, a pastoral supervisor, and only seek help from a therapist if you really, really need it? What are your thoughts?
Wow, I'd say that's a lot of structure. And I would say helpful structure is good overall. I mean, some fellowships and some denominations have that baked into their systems, and I think their pastors do better because they have those layers of connectivity and support.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, the ones who don't aren't. It's pretty simple. If the structure isn't there to bring support, then it's on them. And
Mm,
that's a lot to ask,
mm.
to sort of make up this, not just a development plan, but a care package. And not just that, but I mean, my goodness, when did we ever help them learn how to do any of this? If we're just saying, okay, be warm and well fed, off you go, especially from our schools, I don't know how they're going to do it. And they aren't. So I like the idea of the structure, but I guess I would advocate, and I do advocate for professional counseling being part of the team,
That's interesting.
part of the approach. Just bake it in, just assume it.
Can you
And
speak
even if
more
it's
into
just
that?
for checkup. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
What would that look like, Donald? What does that look like to have more professional counseling baked in?
Well, I think I mean, I would say in my own formal education context, it's us helping our students learn how to um, evaluate, interview, look up, network, and say, this is a non-negotiable. Who's the answer to who is on your team ongoingly
Mm.
is a professional counselor's on your team.
Wow.
And just assume it and just train them that way and send them out that way
Mm.
so that they don't have to go through whatever they go through to get to the point where they're desperate and they have to look around and find somebody. We ought to build networks very intentionally so that
Yeah.
we can help them with that on the front end, the pre-service end,
Yeah.
as they go into and continue in their ministry, I would say.
You've actually given me something to think about because this is also lacking in our profession. It used to be that psychologists were formed by having therapy while we went through our formal degree, whether we were in distress or not.
Mhm.
It was actually considered to be compulsory that you had to receive it. And why? It was the third eye, right? Just even if you're not feeling anything, it was just opening up the landscape of
Yes.
the world so that as you went
Yes.
out and interacted with other people. So am I hearing you say that it's almost like right now, I think in Australia, we put the professional counseling right at the tail end, when things are starting to show signs of breaking. You're saying that let's bring it right up the front.
Yes. So that it's both preventative,
Hmm.
and it's sort of the, I guess, analogous to a well person visit with your doctor. I don't just go to the doctor when I feel terrible or when I need
Yeah,
help or whatever. I go because I go,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
I get a checkup and I get a check-in and I have a conversation.
yeah,
Why can't we think that way about our mental health as well? Uh, I think the stigma, it's not totally gone in our context, but it's been much diminished.
mm,
I would say praise the Lord.
mm,
Um, but it still isn't. Yeah, I'll go when I'm in trouble. It's still the mentality. I'm like, don't wait till you're in trouble.
yeah. I think in Australia, at least from my context, I think we've shifted the dial. I used to see ministers come in when they were on the stretcher.
Uh-huh.
Right now, and stretcher sort of wheelchair, not quite there anymore.
Hmm.
We are seeing them more coming in when they've got a raised temperature, which is
Hmm.
really helpful. But I'm going to
Hmm.
spend a lot of happy time contemplating, pushing, for okay, well, why don't we actually just put counselling right in the beginning? Um,
Sure.
that'd be so. I would love to finish with your take homes for everything that we've talked about. So we've talked about that the loneliness and the isolation. We've talked about the formation issues as well. We've talked about the way that the ministry work role has been structured now that I think it's unbearable. We've talked about levels of conflict in the church. If you had one thing that you would say to a pastor, their family, in the midst of all of that, what would be one thing that someone in ministry can do right now after listening to us?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a different take and a little bit newer take, and I think it's one of the most promising things I've read about in the research. And it comes from a study, that same study from Notre Dame, so far the largest done in the States. And it tapped into this literature called similar others. And I think it has a lot of promise, because what did we say is part of the biggest, what's the biggest problem? Connectivity with others, just simply. Well, part of the issue is, can you find those folks in your system? Oh, maybe, maybe not. You can only go so far and so deep. Well, how do you find them outside the system? Well, this research indicates that maybe there's this middle way of similar others. So, for example, for a pastor, a similar other would be somebody like you. It would be somebody in the helping professions that knows enough about helping, but isn't a pastor, but is a social worker or a professional psychologist or an educator or a doc or a nurse or a hospice caregiver. Well, what if we said to the helping professionals, you guys have enough in common that you could really help one another? Because as you all know, helping the helpers is really challenging. And if each profession tries to come up with its own categories of helping their helpers, I mean, that's a good thing, and they are. But what if we cross-pollinated too? What if we said to the helpers, hey, why can't the helpers help the helpers even as they help others? I'm very interested in that development. I'll put it that way. I think there's a lot of promise in there. And when I've shared that just it's been in the last little while, maybe the last year or two, when I share that with folk both in the pastorate, but then also outside the pastorate to my other colleague friends in the helping professions, they go, oh, I think there's something to that.
Amazing.
So I'm encouraged by that. And I personally would like to do a little more research in that area, because I think there's so much promise there. So that's, like I said, that's relatively a new thing on the horizon here, but I think there's some promise. Maybe we can all think about that together.
Brilliant. And what is one thing you would hope a church listening, if there's a pastor, there's a church listening in, what's one thing you'd like for them to take away that they might think about or do from listening from this?
Sure. I think the local church can be a huge help to pastors and their families. And obviously they need to pray for them regularly. They need to treat them as human beings. It's hard, if not impossible, for a pastor to never be the pastor at the store, in the lawn, mowing the grass. Being a human being is a pretty important thing to be. How can we encourage them to have a life and not just be a 24-hour, 7-day a week? This is your role, is your identity. How can we help our congregations understand that's just not healthy? That's not healthy for anybody. And it's not healthy for our pastors to confuse identity with role. So how can we come alongside and pray for and help and have a bite to eat and just do pretty mundane and everyday things with them, so we can remind ourselves and the pastor that we're human beings together here. We're Christians together here.
Yes.
Not just this hierarchy of callings where the pastor is above and beyond and better be holier than us and that foolishness. I think we just have to learn a new language and learn a new way of relating to those folks. That's supportive and loving and helpful and encouraging.
And finally, policymakers, people sitting in the denominations listening to this, in terms of thinking about how do we look at the work context, job design, the supports that we have. What's one thing you'd like them to walk away with?
Well, I think we need to work on our curriculum to make it more coherent in our formal education. I'm thinking about education first, but I think we need a lot of help making the curriculum coherent so that we don't separate the person and the skill building and the knowledge base, but bring together the know, be, do, because that's who we have in front of our faces as we teach and train and equip. These are whole people. Let's treat them as whole people, and let's treat them as whole people all the way through the curriculum. So that's one thing I'd say to the formal education folk like myself. Denominationally, I think as I said earlier, I think there's a real opportunity to link arms with our educational institutions. we've got to find new and creative ways to do it. Some folk are advocating sort of a hospital residency model, which is
Okay.
intriguing
Intriguing.
for theological education. Some folks are certainly trying to beef up their internship opportunities, even in the midst of formal schooling. I think all those things need to be continue to be tried, paid attention to, captured, reported. If anybody finds some water, share it with somebody else. I mean, I think it's all hands on deck
Mm,
at all the layers of the systems in which we find ourselves.
mm. Oh, thank you so much for spending your time with me. It's been so rewarding and so enriching, and I think just encouraging, just like you said, one body in Christ, for His glory, for His kingdom, and so that
Sure,
word continues to be proclaimed, that we are able to dialogue. So I really thank you, Professor Donald Guthrie, for spending your time with
sure.
us today.
A real delight to see you again, Valerie. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you liked what you heard and you think others should hear it too, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Catch you later.